Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and here we are back for part 2 of the walkthrough of the 2016 New South Wales Eco HSC exam of the multiple choice section. So the previous one, we looked at questions 1 to 10, and you can get there by clicking the links above. And in this section, we'll go through 11 to 20 as the questions ramp up in difficulty. Okay, let's get started. So the question says a government, okay, so G, has changed the method of financing its budget deficit. So if I'm looking at this question and I'm thinking about budget deficits, okay, so I'm thinking it's trying to find a way to bridge the gap between G and T, right? So the budget deficit, that is greater than that. And so we're looking at a way for the government to finance this budget deficit. So the government here says, instead of borrowing from the domestic private sector, so that's one, what it used to do, now it's going to borrow from overseas. Okay, so what I might do is just put a few things down. So number one, under situation number one, it would lead to crowding out, where the government is borrowing money from the private sector, crowds out all the other businesses, pushes up the level of interest rates because there's a reduction in money supply as all of the financial sector wishes to lend to the government rather than the private sector. So that's what would happen, the first one. The second one, if we borrow from overseas, so that's going to increase foreign debt, right? And that will be increase the capital inflow because that big chunk of money coming in, and then as a result of greater foreign debt, then we're going to see an increase in debt servicing. Could probably move this away, which would then give us an increase in NPY outflows, and then NPY outflows that could possibly increase the CAD. Now, I'm not saying you have to do all of this process in terms of your answers, but I just think that trying this process gets you thinking about what are the possible answers before you're confronted with a whole bunch of things that they throw at you. So, for example, if we look here, it says, all other things being equal, what is the most likely impact of this change? So again, I'm going to grab this here. I'm going to say, okay, so it's impact of this change. Okay, so will foreign debt decrease? No, foreign debt is actually going to increase. So it's very easy to get rid of A here. It says the budget deficit will decrease. I'm not sure if the budget deficit will decrease. We are funding the deficit, so I'm willing to kind of consider it as a possibility. Current account deficit will increase. Now, I can see this because of my process over here. And my process over here was very much about, okay, so I'm going to increase foreign debt, greater capital inflow leads to NPY outflows and a larger current account deficit. So I'm cool with C. I can see that. And then our last option there is that domestic borrowing costs will increase. Actually, they will fall, right? Because when the federal government in situation 1 is borrowing locally, that will increase interest rates. Actually, in scenario 2, that local interest rates will fall, there'll be greater money supply because the federal government now goes overseas to find its money. It's not looking domestically. Okay, question 12 takes us into interest rates and monetary policy. So what is the most likely impact? So what is the most likely consequence of an increase in the official cash rate, so an increase in official interest rates on the domestic economy? Okay, so I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, okay, if we get a higher cash rate, what is going to be the consequences? So our starting point is like, okay, so we see an increase in interest rates. What is the best option here in terms of what happens next? So the first thing is that if we increase interest rates, yes, there is lower inflationary expectations, right? That's true. But actually, the currency won't depreciate. The currency is actually going to go up because the Australian dollar will go up because higher interest rates would give greater returns for foreigners on their savings. So A is not possible. Higher inflationary expectations? Not really, because we've got an increase in the cash rate resulting from an appreciation of the currency. So yes, the currency will go up, but actually if the currency goes up, so if there's an appreciation in the currency, a reduction in imported inflation, so there will actually be lower inflationary expectations. So A and B are not possible. If you are still wondering about B, feel free to put a comment in so I can try and help you understand that a little bit more. Okay, C and D get a bit more tricky. So C and D both have the same language: a redistribution of income and wealth, a redistribution of income and wealth. So it says a redistribution of income and wealth towards those with a relatively high MPS, or a redistribution to those with a relatively high MPC. So what it's saying is that money is going to go to people who either save more or spend more. So if I think about what we're creating in this situation, so I've got these two situations. So let's bring this over here. So we say if there is an increase in interest rates, it is most likely that there will be a rise in savings because of this same rationale, that people will be able to get higher returns. So what will happen is that people who are saving will probably make more money because they're able to earn those higher returns. So I'm looking at C thinking like, that's a definite possibility. If I look at D, if rates go up, if people are spending, they're not really going to get more of the share of income and wealth because they're spending that money. And also, if we see an increase in interest rates, we see a decrease in consumption generally. So I think that the best answer here is that the fact that higher interest rates will benefit those who are going to save, so therefore they will get that redistribution. So maybe a simpler way to understand this is that higher interest rates will give the bigger benefit to savers rather than spenders in terms of income and wealth. Bit tricky, bit hard being at question 12 too. But that's the way I would go about it. Question 13. I like question 13 because it shows me, or it could show you, that you don't really have to know every single bit of content to figure these answers out. So let's have a look what I mean. So the Australian government has received a repayment of an interest-free loan. So, okay, so if the government has received this money, then that is definitely going to be some kind of credit, right? Because this is an inflow. And if it's the repayment of the loan, this is not a repayment of the servicing cost. This is a repayment of the whole loan. So this represents capital inflow. This is money coming in to repay that interest-free loan. So if I think about it, it has to be a credit. This is money coming to the Australian government. So if I look here, I could automatically give myself a 50-50. I could say, oh, okay, cool. Look at this. I've only got these two. Now, the reason why I would discount this is that this is not an income flow in terms of the repayment, that the repayment is a capital flow. So it's not going to be in the secondary income account. In fact, it is going to be a credit in the capital and financial account. It is actually a capital flow and not an income flow. So that would be D. Okay, here we are at question 14. So which of the following is most likely to result? So which is going to cause? So we're looking at cause rather than effect. Which of the following is most likely to cause a decline in Australia's terms of trade? So which of the following is most likely to cause a decline in the terms of trade? Now we know that the terms of trade equals the export price index over import price index times 100. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a situation where this whole thing will fall. So if I look at this, I'm like, well, if demand for exports falls, right? Demand for exports falls, so we say demand. If demand for exports falls, generally, that's likely to reduce export prices. So if I'm looking over here, I'm most likely to say, well, I want export prices to fall so that, demand for exports to fall so that export prices will fall. And then if I look at supply, that if I'm looking at supply of exports, if supply of exports increases, that will push down the price of exports. So I would really like increase. That's not possible. This is not possible. Then our answer would be A, because if export demand decreases, that will push down export prices. If supply of exports increases, that will also push down export prices, and that will lead to that situation of a declining terms of trade or a deterioration in the terms of trade. 15, I find particularly challenging. I'm going to talk you through my thinking on this, and you can obviously agree or disagree. So which of the following is most likely to allow an infant industry in Australia to benefit from globalization? I think the most important part here is that the element that we're looking at has to have a positive impact. So it has to be a positive impact on globalization on the infant industry. So all of these are going to have impacts on the infant industry, but we want to make sure that the impact is actually positive. So for example, if we see an increase in Australia's import quotas, that will increase imports, increase competition, and potentially crush the infant industry. That yes, over time competition will be good, but in the infant industry stage, greater competition is probably going to crush this industry. The same deal with B, that if we decrease protection levels, that's actually going to allow this same effect, because if we increase the quota, we're reducing protection. So that this is going to have the same impact, and both of those will end up crushing the industry. That's the same impact as that. So if we go to here, and just in terms of quotas, you'll be able to click up the link above to get more information about quotas. I know that can be confusing for students, and fair enough. So then we've got C. So if we decrease Australia's regulation of transnational corporations, actually, that's also kind of like reducing protection, reducing regulation. So that's likely to allow TNCs again to crush the infant industry. So all of these are essentially the same thing. So A to C is going to reduce protection and have a negative impact on a infant industry. But if we look at D, we say an increase in Australia's recognition of international education qualifications. Okay, so this might then result in an increased supply of skilled migrants, because Australia now recognises their home qualifications, and that could be helpful to the infant industry because we are having a more skilled global workforce that could help the infant industry actually improve its standing, actually get better in terms of its performance. So for my mind, I think D would be our answer in this context. Okay, so question 16 gives us a bit of a calculation. So the table shows selected data. So I've got money or nominal GDP. It's the same deal. I've got population here, and I've got inflation. So let's see what the question's asking. All other things being equal, how are real GDP and the HDI most likely to change from year 1 to year 2? Okay, so a few things we're going to need to calculate. So let's grab a different colored pen, and let's start with real GDP. So the first one will be relatively easy because that's going to equal 1,000 times 1, because 100 over 100 is 1. So then here, this will just give us 1,000 million for real GDP, but this will be slightly different. So we'll have nominal GDP times by 100 over 110, which will roughly equal something along those lines, right? So either way, we can see that between these 2 years, there has been an increase in real GDP, increase in real GDP. So that we can say that that's not possible because that's talking about decrease. Real GDP decreases. No, that's not possible. So this is really good because then now we've got a 50-50 bet. So now we have to think about, well, how does the HDI relate here? That we know that the HDI is more about living standards, that we've got 3 separate measures in the HDI, and nothing is really popping up here. But we know that as part of the HDI, we've got GDP or GNI per capita. And that actually, because we've got this population here, that we can work that out. So if we go for year 1 and we're looking at GDP per capita, that real GDP per capita, that what we would have is which will equal $9 something. So we can see here that, okay, in this situation, that they both don't increase, that actually that real GDP goes up, but GDP per capita goes down. So I think D would be our best bet in this situation. Question 17. An increase in which of the following is most likely to lower the NAIRU? Oh, okay. So we're saying, okay, so something is going to increase. So let's say there's an increase in X, which is not exports, but a variable, and that will lead to a reduction in the NAIRU. So we're looking at some way, potentially, that we are going to be able to reduce things like structural unemployment. Because remember, we're not looking at getting to the NAIRU, we're actually looking at how to reduce the overall level of the NAIRU. So if we look at, say, A and B, that it's sort of a bit vague in terms of B, but I think generally you could say that changing these is about cyclical unemployment, that this is about accelerating AD, about reducing cyclical unemployment. So I'm inclined to cross off A and B, because also government spending is not specific enough. It's not saying government spending on labour markets. It could be government spending on anything. If I look at the use of centralised wage bargaining, that the idea that centralised would somehow help reduce unemployment seems a bit contrary to the focus of the course, that it is likely that centralised wage bargaining for some firms would result in higher unemployment. So I think what's left here is infrastructure investment, because if the government invests in infrastructure, well, then there is going to be a sort of an increased demand for labour. It's very much focused on aggregate supply, that probably in order to get there, we may need to retrain workers, we need to increase the size of the labour force, and that these kind of things would most likely reduce structural unemployment. So I think our best bet here would be C. Now, I know that this may not be a satisfying explanation or answer, but I just think that this makes the best sense, that this is the most likely answer given the kind of theory and perspective we've looked at in terms of the course. So the idea is that with infrastructure, okay, we're going to need to find some ways to increase the labour force. So retraining workers, giving them the right skills. All right, that's the kind of way that we would reduce structural unemployment. That's how I'm thinking about this issue. So the table shows hypothetical data. So we could see here, so Australian dollars in terms of US. So what I might say here is that 1 Australian dollar gets me 70 cents, and then 1 Australian dollar then gets me 75. So between these things, I have seen an appreciation of the currency. So if I'm looking at here, all things being equal, how did the purchasing power of Australian consumers change overseas and domestically from year 1 to year 2? The purchasing power, so the strength of their money. So I know that this is going to be confusing to me, so I'm going to start here. So I'm going to say that if the Australian dollar appreciates, right, so we get an appreciation of the Australian dollar, if there's an increase in the strength of the Australian dollar, well then Australian consumers have greater purchasing power overseas, so then this would be increased. That when I go overseas, that my Australian dollar buys me more stuff because it is stronger. Now, here we go. Here's the tricky part. Let's even switch up the pen. So let's say green. So headline inflation here is 2%, right? So, okay, so if inflation goes up, so that if there is an increase in inflation, and we're talking about domestically, if there is any kind of increase in inflation, then the money of Australian consumers is worth less. Because let's say, for example, that if I have $100 and that if CPI goes up by 10%, then this becomes much weaker, right? So that here, headline inflation has gone up. So inflation goes up. So therefore, purchasing power, we'll just put this in, purchasing power will go down. Now, here's the tricky part. Because it is 1%, it's half of that. You might think, oh, Australian consumers have got more purchasing power. But actually, that they have lost purchasing power because prices have gone up again. So that let's say that in year one, prices go up by 2%. Okay. And then in year two, what we're saying is that not only do they go up by 2% that year, they go up by another 1%. So actually the purchasing power has fallen. So if we look here, that overseas they're doing fine, but domestically they can't afford as much. So stronger overseas, weaker back home. And the idea really is about this, that year one, yep, prices go up at 2%, but year two, they go up by another 1%. So there is still inflation in the economy. Okay, question 19. Now 19, I had to go over a couple of times just to really get it clear in my own mind. So with 19, so we can see here that, okay, so it's for the Australian economy. So I've got loans, I've got assets. What is the value of Australia's net foreign liability? So this relates really to a formula question, and you should really be clear about this. So net foreign liabilities would equal net foreign debt plus net foreign equity. So we've got both of those situations here because the loans owed, okay, so that's net foreign debt. The assets, that's net foreign, it's cool. Net foreign equity. So that if we look at it here, so if you look at, okay, so net foreign debt is going to equal, so net foreign debt is what Australia owes versus what is owed to us, and not the US, but us as in Australia. So if we see here that Australians owe 600 billion minus what foreigners owe us, which is 150. So what Australia owes minus what is owed to Australia. So this will then equal 450 billion in terms of net foreign debt. And then we travel to net foreign equity. And the net foreign equity, okay, so net foreign equity is a little bit different. So what we're looking at is Australian assets that are foreign owned minus foreign assets that are Australian owned. So therefore we've got, okay, so foreign assets owned by Australians, that's going to fall on that side. And then we've got a situation where Australian assets that are owned by foreigners. So that's 100. So 100, 100 minus 250 equals negative 150. And then if we come over here, we say, okay, so net foreign liabilities will equal 450 minus 150 equals 300 billion. And then just to clarify this further, so what we're doing is we're taking this, putting it there. We're taking this, putting it there. And so just one more time. So net foreign debt is what Australia owes minus what is owed to Australia, us being Australia. And this is very much from the perspective of loans. And then net foreign equity is what are the Australian assets the value of Australian assets that are foreign owned minus the foreign assets that are Australian owned. And owned, owes, owed. Slightly different, but very important you can remember it. So that would then give us 300 billion, and that will give us A. Okay, so question 20 was tricky in its time, very tricky. So that what we're saying here is that it can be argued, that a public road is not a public good. So what we're saying here is that in terms of this question, we're saying, okay, so that there is this public road, but how is it possible that it might not be considered a public good? So this requires a little bit of unpacking, as they like to say in the business. So we know that for a public good, and perhaps what we'd say, okay, so we're talking about a pure public good. So a public good, pure public good is non-rival and non-excludable. So if we think about it with a public road, it's unlikely we can exclude people. So a public road is probably still non-excludable because there's no toll roads, there's no barriers, people can drive on it. It's still, is it going well? Non-excludable. I think that we can say, yes, it's non-excludable. But is a public good non-rival? If someone else uses the public road, well, maybe I can't be in that spot at the same time. Maybe we are a bit rival for consumption in this context. It's possible. So if we think about here, if I look at it, let's start from the bottom here. The road is used by both public and private forms of transport. So that's not really dealing with either of these things because this is sort of saying if it's used by both public and private, well, that's sort of saying, okay, cool. So this is non-excludable. So that's saying that actually it is a public good, right? So we're really trying to find a reason why it's not a public good, that is the focus here. So if I grab this here, we're really trying to say, why is it not a public good? So here we go. So when one car uses the road, another car can still use the road. So this is saying that actually that there is no rivals for consumption. But I'm going to put a question mark here because I think that if one car is using the road, another car may not be able to use the road, or it might be slower for them to use the road. So it could change, right? It could change. B says the private sector can build and maintain roads. Okay, but does that mean it's not a public good? I'm not sure about that, but I'm inclined to kind of think of that. Maybe that's a bit of a red herring because private sector and public sector can do it. If I look at A really relates to C. That if we say travel times vary with usage, then what we're saying is that actually people are rivals for consumption. So if we say that actually people are rivals, therefore it's not a public good, therefore A is our best answer. A is our most likely answer. I'm still not sure B, maybe someone can help me out in terms of clarifying that, but I really do see that these two are flip sides of the same thing. This is saying actually that non-rivals, so therefore it is public. Here it's saying, no, they are rivals. Travel times vary with usage. They are indeed rivals. Okay, so that was the second half of this walkthrough. We went through 11 to 20 in this multiple choice section. Hopefully you were able to follow along quite well. If you've got any questions, comments, things to clarify, just drop them in the comments. I'll deal with that and seek to help you out. In the show notes, you'll find a link to the exam itself and the marking guidelines. And I've also got some other walkthrough videos in terms of the short answer section in this exam, and you might like to visit that as you go through this exam in preparation for your HSC. Okay, so hope this was very useful for you. And as always, Thank you very much for watching.